Why the Pope was buried alive, the Conclave's darkest secret. The Vatican was a place of grandeur, of whispered prayers and towering cathedrals, a place where faith was a shield and power was a weapon. But beneath the shining marble floors and the echoes of holy hymns, there were shadows. Shadows that whispered of secrets, of betrayals, of deadly ambition. And in the year 897, one of those shadows took a name: Pope Formosus. Formosus had once been a humble bishop, a man who walked the narrow streets of Rome with his head bowed, a man who spoke of faith and forgiveness. But Rome was a city where faith and power danced a dangerous dance. And as Formosus rose through the ranks of the church, he found himself caught in that dance. He became pope in 891, but his reign was not a time of peace. It was a time of chaos. Rome was a city divided. Noble families fought for control, kings warred over the throne, and the church itself was a battlefield. Formosus was not just a pope. He was a survivor. He navigated the dangerous waters of Roman politics, making alliances with kings, blessing armies, and even negotiating with his enemies. But power is a poison. The higher he rose, the more enemies he made. There were whispers that he had betrayed his allies, that he had plotted against the Holy Roman Emperor, that he had cursed his enemies from the pulpit. But even as those whispers grew louder, Formosus clung to his throne, until death claimed him. But even death was not an escape. For 9 months, Formosus lay in his tomb beneath the marble floor of St. Peter's Basilica. His name was whispered in the corridors of the Vatican. Some spoke of his wisdom, others of his sins. But for Pope Stephen VI, the man who now sat upon the throne of St. Peter, Formosus was a threat, even in death. Stephen was a man of ambition, a man who saw enemies in every shadow. And to him, Formosus was more than just a memory. He was a ghost that could destroy his rule. And so Stephen did the unthinkable. He ordered that Formosus be exhumed. The tomb was pried open, the air thick with the stench of decay. Formosus's body, rotting and shrunken, was dragged from its resting place, dressed in the sacred robes of the papacy, and placed on a throne in the great hall. The corpse sat there, its empty eye sockets staring into the flickering torchlight, a twisted parody of papal authority. The scene was a nightmare. Cardinals, bishops, and priests crowded the hall, their faces pale with shock and horror, but none dared to speak. At the center of it all stood Pope Stephen, his face a mask of fury. He pointed at the rotting corpse, his voice a thunderous roar. "Formosus, you are charged with blasphemy, with treachery, with sin against the Holy Church," he declared. "How do you plead?" Silence. Only the crackle of the torches, the faint rustle of robes, and that rotting, silent figure propped upon the throne. But Stephen was not seeking justice. He was seeking vengeance. He screamed. He raged, his words a storm of hatred. He accused Formosus of crimes real and imagined. The corpse, of course, did not respond. But that did not matter. A young deacon, trembling with fear, was forced to stand beside the body, speaking for it, a voice for the dead. But his voice was weak, his words stuttering. The trial was a farce, a grotesque display of cruelty. And then came the verdict. Guilty, guilty of every charge. Stephen's voice rang out, a cold, triumphant roar. "Strip him of his sacred robes! Cut the fingers from his hand, the fingers that dared to bless!" And the corpse of Formosus, now nothing but a broken, desecrated figure, was dragged from the throne. His fingers were hacked off, his body stripped of the papal garments, and then, in a final act of humiliation, it was cast into the Tiber River. But death, it seemed, was not enough to silence Formosus. His body, swollen and twisted by the river's cold embrace, washed ashore. The faithful whispered that it was a sign that God himself had rejected the cruelty of Pope Stephen, and those whispers grew louder. In the streets of Rome, in the quiet corners of the Vatican, the name of Formosus became a rallying cry. His broken, desecrated corpse became a symbol of suffering, but also of defiance. Stephen's enemies saw their chance. The same noble families who had once feared Formosus now saw him as a martyr. The same priests who had trembled before Stephen now whispered of his madness. And within months, Stephen's rule began to crumble. The Pope who had dragged a corpse to trial soon found himself dragged to his own doom, imprisoned, deposed, strangled in the darkness of his cell. But even with Stephen dead, the shadow of Formosus lingered. The Church tried to forget, to bury the shame of the Cadaver Synod, as it became known. But history would not forget. For Formosus was not just a pope who had been tried after death. He was a warning of how far ambition could twist faith, of how the quest for power could turn sacred halls into chambers of horror. And in the centuries that followed, the Vatican would whisper of Formosus, of his broken body washed ashore, of his silent defiance. A story of power, of madness, of a secret that the Church tried to bury, but which refused to remain buried. The city of Rome trembled beneath the weight of whispered fear. The name of Formosus was a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. In the bustling marketplaces, in the quiet corners of the churches, people spoke of the dead pope who had been dragged from his tomb, who had been put on trial and desecrated. Some spoke in hushed horror, others in fierce defiance, but all spoke. Formosus was dead, but his shadow loomed over the Vatican like a storm. Pope Stephen VI had tried to erase Formosus, to turn him into a symbol of shame, a heretic whose memory would be cast into darkness. But his madness had the opposite effect. The more he raged against the corpse of Formosus, the more the people began to see the truth, that this was not justice, but vengeance, that this was not faith, but hatred. Even the priests whispered in fear. "If a pope can be dragged from his grave, what hope do any of us have?" one murmured, his trembling hands clutching his rosary. But Stephen's fury was not born of madness alone. It was born of fear. Fear of the factions that surrounded him, noble families who sought to control the throne of St. Peter, kings who saw the papacy as a pawn in their endless games of power. Stephen had risen to the papacy with the support of these powerful men, but his position was never secure. Formosus, even in death, was a threat. For his name was a banner to Stephen's enemies. And so Stephen had tried to destroy that name, to bury it beneath shame and horror. But in doing so, he had given it new life. The city simmered with unrest. Some whispered that Formosus had been a saint, a pope who had dared to defy the corrupt, who had blessed kings and guided the faithful. Others believed the stories spread by Stephen, that Formosus had been a traitor, a sinner who had betrayed the church. But in their hearts, the people knew the truth. No saint deserved such a fate. No soul, righteous or sinful, deserved to be dragged from the grave, to be mutilated, humiliated, cast into the cold embrace of the river. In the darkened halls of the Vatican, Stephen paced like a caged wolf. "They whisper against me," he hissed, his voice a growl. His advisers stood in silence, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding his. "They speak of him as a martyr, a saint, a saint." His voice rose to a shout, his fists clenched. "He was a traitor, a usurper, a sinner who betrayed the throne of St. Peter." "Holy Father," one of the bishops ventured, his voice trembling, perhaps we should let the matter rest. The people they are fearful. They speak of Formosus as a symbol of suffering." "A symbol of suffering?" Stephen's laughter was a sharp, bitter sound. "I will show them suffering." His voice fell to a cold whisper. "I will drag them from their homes, these traitors who dare speak his name. I will turn Rome to ashes before I let them make a saint of that corpse." But even as he raged, fear gnawed at him. He knew his enemies were watching, waiting. The noble families who had once supported him now whispered against him. The priests who had once feared him now spoke of his madness, and his allies, those who had once praised him, began to slip away like shadows at dawn. The throne of St. Peter had become a trap, a throne of thorns, and then the city rose. It began with whispers, with murmurs in the streets, merchants refusing to pay the church's taxes, priests delivering sermons that spoke not of Stephen's rule, but of a just and righteous pope who had been wronged. A statue of Formosus, placed in the shadows of a quiet chapel, became a place of secret prayer. Candles burned at its base, and the faithful whispered his name as a saint, not a sinner. Stephen's fury turned to fear. His guards marched through the streets, tearing down the candles, dragging away those who spoke the name of Formosus. But the more they tried to silence the whispers, the louder they grew. The river where Formosus had been cast became a place of pilgrimage. The faithful whispered that his body had washed ashore, a sign from God that he could not be silenced. Panic turned Stephen's court into a den of conspiracy. His allies whispered of his madness, his enemies plotted his fall, and in the shadows of the Vatican, a plan was born. The nobles who had once supported him now saw him as a liability. The cardinals who had once feared him now saw him as a threat to the church itself. One cold night, the palace guards turned against him. His own captains, men who had sworn loyalty to him, dragged him from his throne. "Traitor!" they hissed, their faces shadowed beneath iron helms. "You who defiled the church, who desecrated the dead, your rule is over!" Stephen screamed, his voice a wild, desperate cry. "You fools! I am the Pope! I am the voice of God!" But the guards laughed, their hands like iron. "You are nothing! A madman who thought he could judge the dead!" He was thrown into a cell, the cold stone pressing against him like a tomb. Days passed in darkness, his voice a whisper, his hands clawing at the stone. Formosus, Formosus, he was nothing, nothing. But even in the darkness, that name seemed to whisper back, a shadow that he could not escape. And then, in the stillness of the night, his jailers came. A thin cord, a cold, cruel grip around his throat. His screams were swallowed by the darkness, his thrashing limbs stilled by the cold stone. And as the life drained from his eyes, Stephen VI became nothing more than another shadow in the haunted halls of the Vatican. But the shadow of Formosus remained. Even with Stephen dead, the Church could not erase the stain of the cadaver synod, the trial of a dead pope, the desecration of a man who had become a symbol of suffering and defiance. Rome whispered of it for generations. Historians would write of it in hushed, horrified words. The Vatican tried to forget, to bury the shame, but it was a wound that never truly healed. Formosus was a man who had once sought power, who had walked the dangerous corridors of Rome's politics. But in death, he became something more. He became a warning, a reminder of the darkness that can consume even the holiest halls. The shadow of Formosus lingered like a curse over the Vatican. Even with Stephen VI dead, strangled in the darkness of his cell, the shame of the cadaver synod could not be erased. Rome trembled beneath the weight of whispered horror. Priests spoke of it in quiet, fearful voices. The faithful lit candles in hidden corners, whispering prayers to a pope who had been treated like a criminal even after death. And in the streets, the people murmured of a church that had become a theater of cruelty. But the Vatican could not escape the darkness it had unleashed. For even as Pope Stephen's body was buried in a nameless grave, the church struggled to bury the shame of what he had done. A council was called, a desperate attempt to restore order. to calm the storm. Bishops and cardinals gathered, their faces pale, their voices sharp with fear and anger. "This cannot continue," one cardinal whispered, his voice trembling. "The world speaks of the church as a den of madness, a place where the dead are dragged from their graves. We have become a mockery." "But Formosus was a traitor," another argued, his voice rising. "He plotted against the emperor. He defied the Holy See. Was he not a sinner?" "Even if he was," came a calm, cold voice. "Does that justify this horror? To drag a corpse from the grave, to put it on trial? This is not justice. This is a sin against the very faith we claim to protect." The room fell silent. The truth was a wound that none of them could ignore. The trial of Formosus, the cadaver synod, was not an act of faith. It was an act of fear, of vengeance, and now it threatened to destroy them all. Pope Romanus, who now wore the crown of St. Peter, stood at the center of the chamber. His face was pale, his hands trembling beneath his robes. He was a man trapped between the warring factions of Rome, those who still whispered of Formosus as a heretic, and those who spoke of him as a martyr. And Romanus knew that his throne was a fragile thing, a crown balanced on the edge of a knife. "We must act," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "We must undo the shame of what has been done. We must make peace with the past." "But how?" a bishop demanded. "The people speak of Formosus as a saint. The nobles whisper of him as a banner for rebellion. The church itself is divided." Romanus raised his hand, his voice growing stronger. "We will restore his honor. We will return his body to the tomb, and we will declare the cadaver synod a mistake, a sin born of madness." "But the factions, those who hated Formosus, those who supported Stephen, they will rise against you," another warned. "Let them rise," Romanus whispered, his gaze fierce. "Better a storm than this silence of shame." The order was given. Formosus's body, dragged from the riverbank where it had washed ashore, was dressed once more in the sacred robes of the papacy. The broken fingers, hacked away in that cruel trial, were restored as best they could be, and his body was placed in a new tomb, beneath the shadowed vaults of St. Peter's Basilica. But even this solemn ceremony was haunted by fear. Guards watched the doors, priests whispered nervously, and the candles seemed to flicker with a cold, ghostly light. But the church's attempt to bury the shame of the cadaver synod only stirred the shadows once more. Those who had supported Stephen whispered of betrayal. "He was right," they cried. "Formosus was a traitor. Now they turn him into a saint." Factions rose in the streets, noble families bickered, and the city of Rome trembled beneath the shadow of a dead pope who refused to rest. Romanus himself did not reign long. Within months, he was deposed, his allies scattered, his throne taken by another. The Vatican became a storm of conspiracy, each pope rising and falling like a leaf in the wind. And in the shadows, the name of Formosus continued to echo. Some whispered of him as a martyr, others as a curse, but none could forget him. Years passed, and the madness continued. Popes were crowned, deposed, exiled, and murdered. The church became a battlefield, and the faithful spoke of a curse born of the cadaver synod, of a pope whose spirit could not rest because his honor had been torn from him in death. But not all were willing to let the darkness consume them. In a quiet chapel beneath the flickering light of a dozen candles, a young priest knelt, his voice a whisper. "Saint Formosus," he prayed, his eyes closed. "If you are truly a saint, if you were wronged, bring peace to this church. End this madness." His prayer was a whisper lost in the darkness. But outside, a wind stirred. A cold wind that swept through the streets of Rome, carrying with it the faint scent of the river where Formosus's broken body had been cast, only to return. a river that whispered of secrets, of sins that could not be buried. And then, in the year 904, a pope rose who sought to heal the wounds of the past, Pope Sergius III. But his solution was not peace, it was revenge. Sergius, who had been an ally of Stephen, declared the cadaver synod just, declared Formosus a heretic once more. And with a cold, cruel hand, he ordered that Formosus's memory be cursed, his name erased from the records, his deeds declared null and void. But even this act of vengeance could not silence the shadows. The name of Formosus had become a ghost that haunted the church, a ghost that whispered of suffering, of betrayal, of power twisted into cruelty. And even as Sergius spoke his curses, even as his followers burned the records, there were those who whispered a different name, Saint Formosus, the pope who had been broken, who had been cast into the river, but who refused to disappear. And in the centuries that followed, the church tried to forget. Historians wrote of the cadaver synod with horror, with shame. The Vatican buried the story, but the shadows remained. For Formosus was more than a man, more than a pope. He was a warning, a reminder of what happens when faith becomes a weapon, when power becomes a poison. In the grand halls of the Vatican, beneath the painted ceilings and the golden altars, his shadow lingered. A shadow that whispered of suffering, of shame, and of a secret that the church could never truly escape. Rome was a city of echoes. The grand basilicas, the towering cathedrals, the ancient palaces, all stood as monuments to faith, to glory, to power. But beneath those marble halls, beneath the painted ceilings, there were shadows, shadows that whispered of betrayal, of ambition, of sins that could never be washed away. And in those shadows, one name lingered like a curse: Formosus. Pope Sergius III, who now wore the crown of saint. Peter was a man of iron will and cold vengeance. He had risen to power on a tide of blood and betrayal, a puppet of the powerful Theophylact family, Rome's true rulers. But Sergius was not content to be a puppet. He was determined to stamp his mark on history, to burn his enemies from memory. And to him, there was no greater enemy than Formosus, even though the man had been dead for more than a decade. "Erase his name," Sergius commanded, his voice a sharp whisper in the darkened chamber. His advisors, robed in the crimson of the cardinal's office, bowed their heads. "Burn the records. Declare his acts invalid. Let his name be forgotten." "But, Holy Father," one of the bishops dared to whisper, his voice trembling, "the people, they still speak of him as a martyr. They say he was wronged, that he is a saint in the eyes of God." "Saint?" Sergius's voice was a cold, mocking laugh. "He was a traitor, a liar who defied the Holy See, who betrayed the emperor, a sinner who deserved his fate." "Then why does his name still haunt the city?" the bishop murmured, his gaze fixed on the marble floor. "Why do the faithful still whisper of his suffering?" "Because they are fools," Sergius snapped. "Fools who cling to a ghost. But I will teach them to fear the truth. My truth." And so the purge began. Priests who whispered of Formosus were dragged from their pulpits. Candles placed at his secret shrine were snuffed out. Those who spoke his name were accused of heresy. But the more Sergius tried to erase him, the more his shadow seemed to grow. The streets of Rome whispered of the cadaver synod, of the pope who had been dragged from his grave, who had been judged, cursed, but who would not be silenced. In the quiet corners of the city, the faithful spoke of Formosus as a saint, a martyr who had suffered for his defiance. Mothers whispered his name over their children's beds, a prayer for protection. Priests lit candles in secret, offering silent prayers to the Pope who had been broken but not destroyed. And even in the grand halls of the Vatican, there were those who whispered his name in the darkness. "Your Holiness," a young priest whispered to Sergius one night, his voice a trembling breath. Please let his memory rest. The more we try to destroy him, the more his spirit grows." "Silence!" Sergius thundered, his face twisted with rage. "You dare question me? I am the Pope. I am the voice of God on earth. Formosus is a heretic, and I will see his name burned from history." But even as his voice rose, even as his rage echoed through the grand hall, a cold wind stirred the candles, and for just a moment, Sergius felt a chill that seemed to whisper in the darkness, a whisper that only he could hear. "You will pay." The madness spread. Sergius, desperate to erase Formosus, turned the Vatican into a den of fear. His guards marched through the streets, tearing down hidden shrines, dragging the faithful into the dungeons. Priests were forced to swear oaths, denouncing Formosus as a heretic. His name was struck from the records, his deeds declared null. But even this could not silence the whispers. And then the dreams began. Sergius would wake in the darkness of his chambers, cold sweat clinging to his brow. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, to reach for him. And in the silence he heard it, a faint, trembling whisper. "You will pay." "No!" Sergius screamed one night, his voice a raw, desperate cry. "You are dead! I destroyed you!" But the darkness did not answer. Only that whisper, faint and distant, like a wind rustling through the bones of the ancient catacombs. "You will pay." The Vatican became a prison. The cardinals spoke of curses, of shadows that moved in the halls, of candles that flickered and died without cause. Some said it was the spirit of Formosus, wandering the grand basilica, seeking justice. Others whispered that it was madness, the madness of a pope who had tried to judge the dead, and who was now haunted by the weight of his own sins. But Sergius was not just a madman. He was a tyrant. Those who defied him, who whispered of Formosus, were dragged from their beds, tortured, burned as heretics. The streets of Rome grew thick with fear. The faithful knelt with trembling hands, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper. But fear is a double-edged sword. The more Sergius tried to silence the name of Formosus, the more it spread. In the villages beyond Rome, in the quiet chapels of the countryside, the faithful whispered his name as a prayer. The cadaver synod, which Sergius had hoped to erase, became a story of cruelty, of suffering, of a pope who had been broken but not destroyed. And even within the Vatican, there were those who whispered of Formosus as a martyr, priests who saw the cruelty of Sergius, who saw the darkness that had consumed the Holy See, and who began to question, "Is this the will of God?" they whispered, "or is this the will of a tyrant?" Sergius grew more desperate. His rage turned to paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, betrayal in every glance. Even his closest advisors feared him. But the darkness could not be silenced, for even as Sergius raged, even as he struck down his enemies, the whispers grew. Formosus was dead, but his shadow was alive. A shadow that whispered of suffering, of betrayal, and of a truth that could not be buried. In the end, Sergius died as he had lived, a man consumed by fear, his final days a descent into madness. They said he died screaming, clawing at the air, his voice a thin, desperate cry. "He's here! Formosus! He's here!" But his death did not end the shadow. The church tried to forget, to bury the shame of the cadaver synod beneath layers of history. But the story lived on. A tale of a pope who had been broken, a church that had turned faith into a weapon, and a shadow that could not be erased. The Vatican stood silent beneath the cold, gray sky. Its grand spires reached toward heaven, its golden altars gleamed in the candlelight, and the prayers of the faithful echoed in the sacred halls. But beneath the beauty, beneath the majesty, there was a shadow. a shadow that whispered of suffering, of betrayal, of a secret the church could never escape. The shadow of Formosus. Years passed, and the church tried to bury the shame of the cadaver synod. Popes came and went, each one trying to erase the stain, to forget the horror of a pope who had been dragged from his grave, judged like a criminal, his body desecrated, his memory cursed. But the story refused to die. It became a legend, a tale whispered in the quiet corners of Rome, a story of faith twisted into cruelty. But why? Why had it happened? Why had Pope Stephen VI turned his fury on a dead man? Why had Sergius III tried to burn Formosus from history? The answer was power. Power and fear. The church, which preached of faith and salvation, had become a battleground, a place where bishops were kings, where popes were pawns in the hands of noble families, where the throne of St. Peter was a prize for the ambitious. Formosus was caught in that storm. He had risen through the ranks, a man who had once been a humble bishop, but who had climbed to the highest seat in Christendom. But with power came enemies. Kings who saw him as a threat, nobles who saw him as an obstacle, and priests who whispered of his sins. And when he died, his enemies saw a chance to destroy not just the man, but the memory of him. But the more they tried to erase him, the more his shadow grew. For Formosus was not just a pope who had been judged after death. He was a symbol of how faith could become a weapon, of how power could turn the sacred into a stage for cruelty. Even centuries later, the church could not escape his name. Historians wrote of the cadaver synod with horror. Priests spoke of it in hushed whispers, and the faithful wondered how the house of God could become a place of such darkness. And even in the grand halls of the Vatican, beneath the painted ceilings and the golden altars, the shadow of Formosus lingered, a reminder of a truth that could not be buried. But there is a lesson in the story of Formosus, a lesson that echoes through time, that faith without kindness is a prison, that power without mercy is a poison, that those who seek to destroy the truth only make it stronger. Formosus was broken, cursed, and cast into the river, but his name lived on. His suffering became a story that revealed the darkness hidden behind the holy light. And so, as you listen to this story, remember that the shadows of history are not just tales of the past. They are warnings of what happens when ambition blinds the faithful, when fear twists justice, when power becomes an idol. The church tried to bury Formosus, but his story refused to be silenced, and in that story, there is a truth we must never forget. If you found this story powerful, if it opened your eyes to the secrets of history, please give this video a like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells History, because history is not just about kings and battles, it's about the truths we must never forget.